Hello and welcome to this edition of TZM Global Radio, everyone. I'm your host for today's show, James Phillips from the UK chapter of the Zeitgeist Movement and TZM Education. Hope you're doing well out there, guys. Today's show features an interview with Joe Duggan from Transition Town's Crystal Palace. Crystal Palace is a borough in London, of which Joe is a member, a very active and vocal member of Transition Towns, of which there will be more detail discussed in the interview itself rather than here in this brief introduction. It was a Joe joined us for ZDAY in London 2016. Gave a very entertaining talk about the great work that Transition Towns are doing, both in, well, really in shifting attitudes, I would argue, which is what we are in the business of doing as well. They're doing it with action on the ground, and I think that's such an important distinction, because I think because the movement perhaps often we criticise the entire structure of the system that we're using, because it is based essentially on growth and consumption. And that is, of course, a valid argument to make and a valid point to make. Sometimes you can be in the danger of just looking at everything else as patchwork rather than a kind of integrated evolution of a mindset, a zeitgeist, if you will, out there that's being adopted by the public at large. They're starting to have a serious conversation about these issues. Even if you take something like technological unemployment, when we were talking about that in 2008, we were called Luddites. And now most academics, or basically everyone in the field of academia, is not only accepting it but talking about it, and it's getting on the getting mainstream attention, because people are the evidence speaks for itself and obviously becomes more overwhelming over time. And that's just one of the issues that's now being started to be discussed in public discourse. Obviously, the green economy and man-made global warming and climate change, and these sorts of issues are being adopted into the minds of the masses, so to speak, and people who would otherwise maybe not be sympathetic to the movement's message, because it does involve a very deep and thorough analysis of the system in which we live, which inherently will go up against some people's belief systems and things like that. Transition Towns really provides a platform that anyone from any political persuasion or background can get involved with and identify with and not feel threatened by. And I think that's incredibly important. And we write it off as patchwork at our peril, I think. So, just briefly, we are still accepting submissions for TZM Global Radio. If you would like to make a submission, please do so to submit at thezeitgeistmovement.com, or get in touch with me, or I should say, and get in touch with me on Facebook, James Phillips, or via email, jamesshock@hotmail.co.uk. All your radio show needs to be really is interesting, of reasonable sound quality, and not have copyrighted material in the main body of the show. We do need more voices on this radio show, everyone, and the more that they come from varied backgrounds and different chapters around the world, the better. So, without further ado, we will now crack on with the interview that I conducted between myself and Joe Duggan from Transition Town's Crystal Palace. There won't be an outro to this radio show, so I will just say goodbye for now. Goodbye for now. Hey Joe, how you doing?
Hi James, how are you? Okay.
I'm very well, thanks. Thanks very much for joining us on TZM Global today. It's a pleasure to have you, and it was a pleasure to have you at ZDAY. So I think the best place to get started is for yourself to give yourself a little introduction, and maybe just introduce also what you were at ZDAY to represent.
Absolutely. So my name is Joe Duggan, and I am one of the co-chairs of Crystal Palace Transition Town. And we are a transition town, one of the busier transition towns in London. It's a global movement with a started in Totnes national movement, but it's very much grassroots movement in the sense that each group and each initiative is different. So what I came along to TZM to talk about, what I felt comfortable talking about was what's happened with Crystal Palace Transition Town as an initiative in South London since 2010, 11, since I've got involved in it. And yeah, we've had a lot of successes. So I wanted to kind of tell that story a bit because I think it's a pretty good story. And I also wanted to tell it in a kind of honest way that was, warts and all as well. But I think it's a story worth telling. I think there's lots to be proud of.
Yeah, I think I thoroughly agree. I know that your lots of people were talking very highly of your talk. They really enjoyed it, and it was nice to get that sort of hands-on, well, it's not hands-on, but ground-up experience of what's going on with people trying to make this transition into some sort of sustainable economy and sustainable world. So it was definitely an enjoyable talk, and we were very very pleased. That we booked you. I mean, sometimes we book organisations and we don't necessarily vet the speakers before they turn up. So you do always have this little moment where you're just kind of going, really hope this guy or this lady is really good, and you know,
Yeah, yeah.
but yeah. So it was an excellent talk. We really appreciate it. I mean, what was your opinion of the rest of ZDAY as an event, and what you heard to do with the other ideas and the movement? Is there anything that stuck out as particularly interesting for you that you'd like to discuss, maybe?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, I loved the whole thing. It was a lot of fun and it was a lot of inspiration. I, in a general sense, I enjoyed, the crowd, the energy, the sense of hunger in the room for new ideas, and I thought that was very exciting. In terms of the talks, I enjoyed them all, and I thought that my talk kind of fitted in, slotted in very nicely because there was lots of you know uh, stuff on the sort of more conceptual levels and on different levels of how you can impact change, and I found that really enjoyable. I mean, there was the IT tech element, the really interesting ways that we can use technology. There was David Woods with his futurist vision that was quite similar to a global vision of maybe what a transition town's trying to do. I felt that those resonated very closely, and things like the basic income talk and the yourself with the scene setting and the talk at the end about how do we engage people. I mean, it all clicked together very nicely as a kind of a little bit of a manifesto for change, didn't it? I really enjoyed a lot of it.
Yes, I would agree. I'd love to take all the credit, but I'd have to leave that to my partner and girlfriend, Sarah. She pieced together the program, and a fine job she did too. And she actually pieced together the running order. And like you just said, I think the running order of these events are actually, you have to give them some thought, because it's like you want the story to be told and in a kind of way, and you want it to flow right, and I think it did. You've already given a very brief outline of your topic, and we will go into more of the specifics to do with transition towns and the fine work you're doing in Crystal Palace. But just briefly, what did you? Now you've sort of seen what the movement advocates. How would you sort of see transition towns as part of that? Why do you think that it's important to maybe what we're saying? How does it chime in, I suppose?
Um, Well, I suppose I suppose I mean, I need to learn more about TZM, I want to learn more about it and get a stronger sense of it. So I need to be sort of put that in as a caveat in terms of my understanding of it. But I suppose my understanding is that it's kind of what happens on the ground. And I think with what we do in Crystal Palace Transition Town and what other transition towns do, it's a tool that can be used, and I think it's a very flexible tool that can be used as part of a bigger movement, of a bigger movements one word, or initiative or thrust or drive towards sustainability and towards awareness and towards action. So I think it clicks in there as part of that broader scope. And I know that Rob Hopkins and the transition time movement, he's very much open about the fact that the transition time movement is only part of any solution in itself. It doesn't claim or pretend to be a kind of silver bullet for everything. And there's lots of other, and I think if we can all move forward together as much as possible, I think that's really exciting. And I get a sense that it certainly is happening to an extent.
I think also the thing that stood out for me about transition towns in the past, and both listening to your story, is that everyone is locking into the idea that what we've got is unsustainable, and just the fact that you're joining a local initiative and people get that sense of community,
Yeah.
and that community local sort of people on the ground doing doing things is generating a mindset, that then hopefully will filter out into a broader scope and a wider sort of understanding. And I think people joining those types of initiatives, having the types of discussions, no doubt, that you have in your group, will lead people towards understanding the larger order argument that the movement make, that ultimately the system that we have at the moment, because it's based on consumption, because it's based on growth, is inherently unsustainable. And I think possibly that one feeds into the other, if you know what I mean. People who might not have been willing to accept those arguments, but realise that there's a problem, would get involved in something like transition towns, and for want of a better phrase, it sort of butters them up in a way for the larger argument. Would you say that might be a merit as well?
Yeah, well, I would say there is truth in that. I would say also if you try to get involved in sustainability and you also come across barriers and you come across limitations and you start to realize maybe the limitations of democracy, or democracy in inverted commas, and the systems as they stand, and it can be frustrating sometimes, but it does, it's almost like if something doesn't quite succeed on the ground, you might have a slightly utopian version of what you want to achieve in Crystal Palace, like growing all our own food, or, a market that can feed everyone, and where all the prices are able to be really cheap and everything. And then when it doesn't work, then that can definitely lead you to ask bigger questions about why can't we do this? What's wrong with the system that forces us to work in this way? And then there is a kind of radicalization, and I know that word's very loaded nowadays, but a kind of a questioning of a lot of what's going on the bigger scales as well. Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah.
So, how did you sort of come across transition towns? How did it come upon you that you should maybe get involved and get started in Crystal Palace?
Well, I was quite honest about this in the talk, in that, well, I suppose I'm one of those people that um, would say they're an environmentally minded person on paper, but wouldn't necessarily feel like they were doing that much about it in practice, up until about 2010. And then, although, a few choices I've made, I've chosen not to drive my whole life for that reason, and I've not to fly, and various things. But, I felt like I didn't really put my money where my mouth was. So this group came along, poster up in a community notice board about something about making the area more sustainable, moving away from reliance on oil, and thought, okay, I'll go along and check that out. But I didn't. I was just curious, so I think I mentioned that in the talk at the very beginning. I wanted to be a peripheral person. I didn't really want to lead on anything. So in the early meetings of so there was a guy who had read Rob's first book, The Transition Handbook, and a guy called Andy, and he was saying, this is a good vision. I think we can try this in Palace. And I was like, yeah, yeah, yeah. But, you guys get on with it, and I'll step back a little bit, and then I'll jump in when I'm ready. But I found myself getting quite heavily involved fairly early on.
And tell us about your early beginnings. I mean, there was that, and then and how did it grow? How did you ensure that it got to the very admirable size that it currently is? And what is that size? Just to give our listeners a sort of idea.
Yeah, well, okay, in terms of size is a little bit of a tricky thing to measure because we've got very fuzzy boundaries. we're not a membership organization, and we like it that way in that, technically anyone who's in Crystal Palace can be can get involved in Crystal Palace Transition Town activities, which is potentially thousands of people. So we keep it like that. So it's quite difficult to measure how many people are actively involved. But I think, I at the talk I mentioned that we had around 30 or more initiatives, and each one of them has a cluster of people. We also have a food market that has footfall in the hundreds every week. So maybe probably a cluster getting towards 1,000 of people, maybe interacting in different ways with the group, but maybe a smaller core. We tend to get around 100 or AGM or maybe slightly more. But yeah, so there's kind of quite a good reach into the community, and there's different lots of different levels of entry and different level depths of involvement. So there's people like myself that are pretty committed now and spend a lot of our time at it. And there are people who would still really enjoy the brand and be interested in it, but wouldn't necessarily have the same level of spending time connected. So sorry, that wasn't a very clear answer, but it's a bit of a cluster. So yeah, but I feel like it's quite, if you ask people around Crystal Palace, and particularly the triangle area of Crystal Palace, the brand recognition really isn't bad for a community organization. I think it's quite high. And I think the food market, our biggest project, really helps that as well.
I think
Sorry,
it's
that was quite a long answer.
no problem. I thought it was a pretty impressive answer, actually, especially seeing as you found those early beginnings. And our chapters in the movement, we have local chapters as well, and they start off the same way. They start off with a couple of people, and things. But I think the thing I really liked as well is the projects, actually, and I'd like to hear a bit more just
Sure.
for our listeners about that, because I think it's the projects that kind of keep people wanting to come back. Maybe I don't know how you feel about that, but you've got some very interesting projects. So I'd like to hear about some. Just pick and choose some of the special ones to tell us
Yeah.
about.
Well, yeah, so once we kind of had our initial steering group and the constitution and some quite, stuff that dragged a little bit, a member of our group, Rachel, decided that she wanted, so there's these kind of themes within the transition town. Can we grow our own food? Can we supply our own energy? Can we sort out waste? Can we sort out transport? How far can we go down these roads? So Rachel connected with Croydon Council, and we managed to get a growing space. And from that, we got not a particularly attractive space, and that became our first cluster point, and there was a lot of energy and excitement there. And from that, we converted that into a prize-winning community garden, which is still, I was down there today, and it's still a lot of fun and a lot of buzz around it. And so that became an exciting connecting point. And then, I mean, there's a lot to try and summarize, but the next kind of really big stage, we got some more community gardens going. We got a draft busting energy projects going. Um, but then we had this idea, we asked this question at our next AGM: how can we source more of our food locally? Because this is well and good growing little bits of food in community gardens, but how can we upscale that? And someone at that meeting then, Karen, came along with a new vision, which was, what about a local food market? And at the time, that felt very ambitious. I was thinking, I thought somebody was just going to say do a bigger community garden, but again, a cluster of people gathered around that and led on that for a while. And after a year, we started a weekly food market, which has big footfall, is considered a real central point of the Crystal Palace community. Has now been going. Yes, 3 years, and it's kept top three BBC Food and Farming Awards. It gets a lot of recognition. It's became a hub. It has then had spin-off projects. Once you start getting this idea of, we have a nice idea that I mentioned in the talk of doocracy, where we celebrate the people who do things. And so from the food market, we've started a craft collective, which is very successful. That has now spinned off into its own markets as well. It's created its own larger events. And we also have a thing called a patchwork farm, which is the idea that you can't have a farm in a city, but you could have a patchwork farm made up of lots of little growing spaces. So that's kind of like a network of our community gardens and people who grow on different sites. And there's a stall every week where people bring along their gluts and bring along the harvest from the community gardens. So you start to get this idea of actually a sustainable town starting to come together. And to be realistic, the yield in these gardens isn't very high and it's not enough to sustain people, but that alongside the food market, which the food at the market is all sourced from around 30 miles away, and it's all sustainably sourced. So, we're providing a really meaningful alternative there. And some people like numbers, so we've worked out that over £1 million has gone through the since it's begun. And that's money that's going to small businesses, startups. Some of them are local startups and small organic farms in Kent and Sussex countryside. So that's all happening. Yeah. Other projects. So it's a lot of it's led by the passion of the members. So we had a big thrust on fair trade when there was a woman who's very passionate about fair trade. So we had a lot of big events there. Um, we've got people that are passionate about cycling. So there's initiatives around cycling. We're pushing forward on some solar panel initiatives, which have got a lot of promise. We do community cleanups. We grow our own beer, which is a really cool project called Palace Pint. There's jam making called Palace Preserves, and I'm sure there's more that I haven't quite thought of. Oh yeah, and we've got more recently. Somebody said we're not doing enough for children, and they started doing their own children and baby events. This becomes quite a comprehensive list of activities. Yeah.
Beer, food, and energy. What else do people need?
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's I was actually glad you mentioned energy, because I was going to say, I mean, first of all, the pictures of how your local garden transformed itself is really impressive, and a picture often speaks 1,000 words. So when we get your talk up on our main channel from the day, I do implore people to go and have a look at it, because from what it turned into is evidence that your duocracy philosophy is certainly paying dividends. And you also mentioned it, the way Crystal Palace is geographically, it kind of brings everyone into the centre a little bit. That was quite an interesting concept. Would you like to discuss that a little bit more?
Yes, and that came up in the questions at the end as well. I'm from small town Ireland myself, and I think that London and bigger urban places can be a bit difficult in terms of where is the community hub, where do people tend to rub shoulders. And I thought that, I mean, this is just my own theory a little bit, but I think Crystal Palace has got a very distinguished triangle of shops. And that means if you go to a pub or you go to a cafe or you do your shopping, you're quite likely to circulate and bump into the same people. So I know early on I felt that Crystal Palace, by definition, can be much broader than the triangle area. But I felt that if we targeted that area, there's really a sense where all the energies can mix in a kind of hub. So community gardens and where we have our meetings and where the market is now, they're all within walking distance of each other. And it means that there's a lot of this cross-fertilization of bumping into people and circulating, which isn't so easy to get in cities. So I thought that was a good thing. I also thought that, I mean, I don't want to claim credit for everything. I think Crystal Palace seemed to have a culture of community and friendships and talking to strangers. When I moved here, and first, over 10 years ago, and sort of got interested in the area, that I think maybe we benefit from as well, and previous good community initiatives. Like there's a good festival here that we didn't start, but we've been partnership with, and I think they've all been positive factors, if you like, in terms of making this work.
Absolutely, absolutely. How do you? How can people get involved in either your transition town? But I mean, realistically speaking, most people listening to this won't be near the Crystal Palace area. They may want to get involved in their local ones. I mean, first of all, how does transition towns look across the UK? What's their sort of, and maybe further afield? What's their sort of I don't know. How are they looking on a grand scheme of things? How do people get involved in their local communities? All of that stuff.
Yeah, so there's the Transition Network website would be the best place for that, and I will get you the link while I'm talking. It's yeah, I'll find out while I'm talking to you. So, and it has a map on it which shows you your nearest initiative. And in the UK, there are hundreds of initiatives in the UK. There's quite a good um, little pocket of initiatives around London, and then they broaden out all across the UK. Globally, I was at the Transition Network conference this year, and I know that there were 30 international hubs there. So that means that there are anywhere that's got a hub, it means that there's a good cluster already in that country. So throughout Europe, South America, even Thailand, I mean, almost completely internationally. Good, strong presence, as it seems, in places like Australia and New Zealand as well. So as it is becoming, and America has really taken, US has really taken off as well, the United States. So there's quite a lot of activity and quite a variability in terms of scale. Some of them are smaller, some of them might be just one project, but some of them can be broader as well. Yeah, the website is www.transitionnetwork.org, which is probably the best go-to place.
Right. Okay. Well, that's fantastic. Have you got any sort of what's your plans for the future? What's the next development of Transition Town Crystal Palace then, for example?
Well, one of the things that we want to do is maybe solidify what we are doing and try and make some of our successful projects a bit more permanent and upscale them a bit. So with the community growing, we're looking at increased yields and professionalize it a bit. So there might be a need for um, almost everything we do at the moment is volunteers. The only exception to that would be the food market. And the food market sustains itself and pays its own employees. So we're looking to create more models a bit like that, so things can become a bit more permanent. Um, there's also a few exciting projects which are very new to the group, and I think they've got real potential. We've had our second food not waste event, which is a community meal where people if someone, because we're a bureaucracy, so somebody approached us and was passionate about food and waste, and that's been in the news a lot this year. So somebody called Kirsty came along and said, I want to do something about this. What can we do? So she attracted some more people around her, and they went out into the community and started collecting waste food and creating a free community meal at a local church. And we've had three of those now. Now, Kirsty actually moved away, but because the idea had such momentum, there's a few other people, Bernie and Anna, and a few others who've got involved in that. And I think it's a great idea. So we had 80 people at our last meal, and it's such a warm and fun thing to do, cooking collectively with essentially free food that would have been thrown out otherwise. And then all the businesses have come behind it, started supporting it and stuff. So that's one really exciting idea. But there's a lot of stuff happening. Yeah.
There's-
I've got one more. I've got one more I'd like to mention.
yeah, go.
We are hoping to have a thing called the Energy Garden at Crystal Palace Station, which will, fingers crossed, have both a growing element to it and a renewable element to it. So that's in talks because there's a few different parties involved in that one, and because it's at a train station, there's some challenges around planning and stuff. But fingers crossed, we're going to have an exciting project there as well.
That sounds really, really good. I'm really glad you mentioned the food not waste project there. There's a place we run our events at, a venue called Passing Clouds, which for some reason has completely escaped my memory as to which part of London it's in.
I think I know where that is. Yeah, is it Dalston?
That's it, Dalston.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So we run documentary screenings there sometimes, and just before we put our screenings on, there's been a sort of community meal from the leftovers from shops around in the local area. And I think it's such a simple, on our way there, food waste is so horrific. You look into some of the percentages of what people are wasting, and you just think this, it's criminal, really. So to hear other people out there around London are doing a similar thing is so great, because when we went to this beforehand and we were in there was such a great community spirit, and people just felt good for the fact that it wasn't going to waste and it was helping to feed the community, and people were involved, and it was certainly a good vibe. So that sounds great. And is there any what else would you like to, is there anything else you'd like to tell our listeners before you leave? Anything else that that we've missed perhaps?
Yeah, I thought maybe I should mention, that the overall one of the key words within the transition movement is around resilience. around making your community resilient. And I think as an organization, because it's a bureaucracy, it doesn't really look like it's got a strategy, Crystal Palace Transition Town, because in a way it doesn't. The strategy is decided by the projects and what they pick up and they go for. But I think now that we're 5 years in, there really is that sense that we have built a kind of network of resilience, of connections, makes the community stronger. And interestingly, just going back to your earlier point about you know, how people's attitudes can change getting involved in projects. We at the start, I think we were more hard green in a way, that we really felt everything had to be very green. But as we've grown, we've allowed it adapt into the community to become more accessible. But what actually has happened is that as people have got more involved, then you start asking questions about the environment, about the economy, about local economy decisions. So how come chains can come into an area that's got a strong, resilient, independent shop community, which we have in Palace? How come that can happen? That just seems crazy. Can we not be supporting these local independents? So you start developing this bigger narrative that people really buy into, and sometimes we meet people who I've never met before, and not even not sure what the Transition Town do, but they say, "Yeah, Crystal Palace is a place that really supports this independence, isn't it?" And so there's that bigger narrative that starts to come out, which is quite exciting as well.
Yeah, absolutely exciting, and it's really, really. We were really pleased to have you, and pleased for the work that you're doing, and certainly, if nothing else, we take away the idea of the duocracy. I think that's fantastic, and I think that's certainly something that the movement in its local chapters could adopt. It's one we have been trying to push when we're in meetings. That if people want a job done, then to get involved and do it themselves essentially. So yeah, and everything else sounds really positive as well. So thanks very much for joining us on the show today, Joe. And I hope you had a good time.
Yes, I did. No, it was a lot of fun. Thank you very much. It was really interesting. I should mention, just in terms of fun things, today someone had the idea to create. Someone has been working on a rap video in one of our edible gardens. So there was filming of a rap video. So maybe I'll stick that on your website or on your Facebook group when it comes out. So it looks like it's going to be a lot of fun about transition time. So that's what I was at today before I came here. So it was fun.
Oh,
But
that's
yeah, no,
fan-
thank you so much. It's been a lot of fun.
Oh, that's fantastic. Did you manage to squeeze in any rap lines yourself?
No, I left that to the professionals in this case, yeah, and I think they've done a good job. It looks like it's going to be quirky. I think it's going to be entertaining. Yeah.
Oh, that's fantastic, because I think if you can't we can't make people laugh on the way in this transition, I think it might be pointless.
Yeah, absolutely.
So on that note, I think that's probably a good note to leave it on. So once again, thanks very much for joining us on the show today, Joe.
Thanks, Amelia. Thank you so much. It's been very interesting.